we'll get into some of the slides. I'll put it into present mode. Um, but what I wanted to start with was just give you an understanding of a threat model. So in the first few groups, we're kind of going through some of the nuts and bolts of security, what a threat actor is, what a threat vector is, what a vulnerability is. So Damiano's really drilling into that right now, and then Maurice is also taking that intermediate layer of really drilling into reviewing an exploit and reviewing a vulnerability, what a vulnerability is. Now, what a threat model does is in an organization, it allows the cybersecurity team to go through and start analyzing some type of system or set of systems and start predicting what could go wrong with those systems with regards to cybersecurity. So what we mean by that is what could go wrong if we leave a vulnerability in that system and we ultimately leave that system vulnerable. So if we took a Windows server, there is a threat model that we could conduct against that Windows server. If we take a web application, like a website, whether it's running on WordPress or if it's running on Wix or a different content management system, we could develop a threat model. And the idea there is for the security team, before something is developed and before something is pushed to a production ready environment, that there is a review of the designs and the plans, and to ultimately identify what could go wrong in regards to what threats can exploit vulnerabilities in a system. So that's the main idea of it. It's taking that intermediate and base knowledge of threats, of threat actors, and of vulnerabilities in a system and developing it. And now one way to really get into that, there's a lot of frameworks out there, and there's a lot that we could find online, very easy to search them. One that's actually really good is something called basically Stride. So Microsoft has developed this. It has been around for about 15, 20 years now, and it is a very good one to start with for threat model and to understand the nuts and bolts of it. So what is it? What is what is Stride, or what does that mean? So there are 5 components to it, and you'll see here on the screen. It's spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and escalation of privileges. So what does that mean? So these are basic ways of framing the threat model. So it gets the team, the cybersecurity team, and then some of their developers, some of the engineers in the organization to start thinking through what could go wrong. And these 5 steps are ways of which something could go wrong. So spoofing uh, is related to identity and access management. So back to what Damiano was working through, there's a lot of baseline knowledge of identity access management that one would want to have in order to start tackling something like a threat model, especially spoofing. And what that means is that we have right here someone pretending to be someone they aren't. So they're spoofing them. They may do that by stealing credentials and thinking they're someone they aren't. Uh, tampering. What would happen? I mean, tampering is someone trying to get into a website, maybe spraying graffiti on the website, or if the website's for something about the New York Yankees and how great the New York Yankees are, they could come in, tamper with the website, and talk about how the Yankees aren't that great, and start writing uh, things on the website that aren't supporting the Yankees and things like that. So it can be damaging, tampering. And so by going through that, you go through those scenarios and you talk about how you potentially could tamper a situation. or a website, I should say. Repudiation is talking about does someone essentially, uh, you know, um, are they actually who they say they are? And that's another example of of the third framework or the third step in the framework on the threat model. Information disclosure. This is basically what we hear all the time in security incidents. So this is theft of data. This basically means that data was taken out of uh, a server, a system, a website, and it's been taken. We all hear about credit card information being taken. We all hear about social security numbers taken, things like that. So what you're seeing here is essentially again, another basic step on what a threat model is and how information disclosure leads to a lot of our typical security incidents we hear. Denial of service. This particular point in the framework is referring to basically shutting down systems. So you may hear of that. Many years ago, there were plenty of denial of service attacks against banking institutions. And again, it was to try to cause some type of disruption. So in your mind, when you're building these frameworks out, that's where you come with denial of service and you start putting your mindset in there. Escalation of privileges. So, what is this? This is basically someone who gets access to a system and ultimately finds a way to get full administrative privileges. So it's basically like someone who got into your garage and then was able to break the lock on the garage door leading into the home and then is able to get into the entire home. So I'll pause there, Adrian. Or Reza, any questions just on this?
Um, Going back to spoofing, from what I heard or what I interpreted, spoofing from your perspective or the context you use it in was sort of like a social engineering. Yes, no?
So that is one step that we'll get to, yes, spoofing, where you basically have taken someone's credentials. So when you think of that, yes, the short answer is you're right. It could definitely be conducted through social engineering, because what you're essentially doing is taking over an account, taking over a system, and then pretending it's something that it's not.
Gotcha. So in addition to that context it was using, does this domain include like IP packet spoofing, MAC spoofing, and the whole gambit?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are, and if they apply, absolutely, yes. That would
Okay,
include that as well. Yes.
got it.
So what we could do, we could actually go through some information now if we want. Um, how does it look? What would you like to do, Adrian? I'll leave it kind of up to you if you want to drill into an actual threat intel, or I should say threat model. Um, we could go in. I could kind of drill into what they look like, what will work for you. I could take you kind of multiple directions.
You know best. I mean, I chose this group because I'm not too familiar with threat modeling. So wherever
Okay.
you seem fit to start, go for it.
Yeah, sure. So let me kind of drill into like what this is for telehealth, and then we're gonna go into this, and then we'll move on to the threat intel report. But here's what we go with threat modeling. So here's an example of how you get very detailed into one. So this one's for a telehealth system. So I think this is fairly fitting. The reason why I chose this one as part of the curriculum was because telehealth is definitely at the forefront of what we're seeing with the pandemic now, and how people are not visiting their doctors and they're actually going through other means, in that case to telehealth. So introduction here goes through how these plenty of improvements in quality of healthcare with through the digitalization of health records, things like that. But this also gives you a background on the telehealth system, and then actually gives a little bit of a breakdown in the overview and what a threat model is. So basically, what I described it is, it helps with understanding security threats and vulnerabilities. and how those threats are going to impact our users and the ultimate organization. So it makes sense. We, in a telehealth model, we would not want that system to be insecure. So by doing this threat model, we are working through scenarios to understand how can we better secure this system before we find out the hard way. That hard way is someone trying to take over that system, someone trying to steal information on patients, steal their patient records, things like that. So so far what I'm going through, Adrian, does that make sense? Why we chose kind of a telehealth system? Why that is relevant to today's world?
Absolutely. I'm
Okay.
with you.
All right, great. So what also is trying to get into the minds of the students is we went through Stride and we said, okay, there's the different scenarios of Stride. How does that even apply? So this is where this is where it now gives you and anyone else and the students particularly more data and more applicable to what they're going to see. So you see here the threat model piece that they have been drilling into has been specifically they want to start with the assets and the access points. So to them, an asset is obviously where they're laying out what's very valuable. Then obviously they're looking at why that is definitely going to be the most important piece because that's ultimately their target. And the target is what the threat actors are going to try to exploit. So that's where you're trying to break into. It's trying to essentially find the safe in the house, and you're trying to get into it. So the other thing there, which is important to know, is then identifying the access points. So what they're saying is the asset might sit in someone's living room or maybe in someone's bedroom. And now, what are the access points? Well, there's windows that might be open. There are front doors that might be open. There's back doors that might be open. The garage door might be open. Those are the kind of things they're looking at. And logically, they're looking at how do I get into that system? So you look at passwords, what access can get into the system. How do I access that system? How does an end user access it? How does the backend administrator access it? And so they're describing what the potential threats are. And here's pretty much what we've already drilled into. And so I summarize this, won't go too far into it, but they're going through what we just laid out, the Stride model. That's what they're thinking of using. So they identify the access, the assets, they identify what are the access points. Now they're logically thinking, how can I break into this system? So I'll pause there. Any questions?
No questions. You're doing an excellent job.
So do you understand who would want to use a threat model in this
Yeah.
context?
The security team to do an audit to see where the weaknesses lie and how to
Great.
improve upon them.
Yeah, great. That's a really good example of where they would do it. Another area where they would look at it for auditing, if you take that example to expand upon it, an approach is when an organization is designing and planning out this telehealth system. This is where it's really good to bring in security and have them do this threat model. And leveraging this would actually be really, really good. And it will help the organization learn that up front versus later after the system is in production. What's really good here is the big nuts and bolts of it that I think is a very big takeaway, which unfortunately I'm not highlighting it very well, but is countermeasures. And the whole point is, as you look to design and you look to do that audit as you reference, it's good to identify the threats and it's good to know what countermeasures or controls should be put in place by the organization and by the teams so that they prevent any of those threats from actually happening. So does it kind of give you the picture as to who would use it, why they would use it, and ultimately how they would use the threat model.
Yes, it does. Now,
Okay,
just
great.
to clarify, this can be done at any stage. It can be done at the beginning, middle, or God forbid, the end.
Yes, it can, and it could be, and it's used in multiple facets. The team that may use it at the beginning is going to be the where you hear the term security architects. So that's a part of a team that they are very advanced members of a cybersecurity team. They have a lot of experience as security analysts. They have a lot of experience as security engineers. They have built and designed security programs. They have a lot of experience with vulnerability management, threat modeling, and just overall threat vectors. They understand a lot of the nuts and bolts of security, understanding packet analysis, understanding how a threat can flow through the network, things like that. So they would do it up front as a design. Another team that would use it, interestingly enough, is the red team. So a red team would
Hmm.
come in. They would love to do it, and they'd love to do a threat model for a system that's in place, because then they'll know, okay, I've identified some threats that don't have countermeasures against them. So I know that this system is now technically vulnerable, and so they'll focus their efforts on whether it's a pen test or it's some other initiative, some hacking initiative. They'll do this as part of their first baseline model of how actually uh, to understand a system and know what threats could be applicable, and then they'll go through a lot of their phases of hacking. So it's kind of interesting how it can be used, and multiple parts of an organization may use it. Um, at the end, you may see a security operations team, which is a blue team. The blue team may also use the threat model, and that allows them to utilize countermeasures for how they may build out new alerting and detection on a system, and use that for a lot of their big monitoring that they're using in the system. So without kind of going into any further, you'll see here is an overview of just what the system is. This healthcare. So it talks about point of care, some of the infrastructure it has behind it, and then it drills into the threat model components, which I think is pretty fascinating as well. So as we said before, they drill into the assets. One area they're talking about for point of care, patient credentials, obviously pretty important. Communication devices, pretty important. Uh, Again, application on patient communication devices, what software might be on a laptop, what software might be on a phone, and then even going into other things like medical devices, pretty interesting stuff. Now, of course, the infrastructure, you knew this would be here. PII is going to be, health records, very important asset. So again, they're inventorying a series of assets because that's going to help them with their threat model. Then they even did a little bit more, just kind of the actual flow of individuals and how it flows through the system, and then ultimately we get through some trust levels that they've described here. But really wanted to get to the next piece, which is identifying the threats, which are pretty interesting. So they've got a few here that they have laid out. Patient identity loss or identity sharing. That's part of spoofing. They've even put an impact here. What is the impact? Is it low? Is it high? Is it medium? PII loss, again, spoofing is high. They went through here a few others, identity theft and misuse. So basically taking the identity, and this they're saying is elevation of privileges. So someone here who is helping out with the system, an assistant, essentially is able to gain access to the system and steal credentials, and steal not only credentials but also patient information. So logically, when you think of where the threat model comes, going back to no matter where it is, beginning, middle, or end, uh, each person in a security organization, whether that's the security architect, the red team, or the blue team, will break it out this way. They'll add the assets, they'll identify what those assets are, they'll start to go through scenarios. So they'll go through the scenarios and start to flesh this out. So there's definitely a lot here. But I just wanted to really give a summary for you to start to give you that knowledge of just kind of where you may see threat models, why they're done, and by who in the cybersecurity organization would be doing these. So any questions you may have?
No questions.
Okay.
Let me ask something just for my own curiosity, but my wondering is how static does the threat assessment remain? So if someone came in as a group, they did it internally or externally, does that remain the same, or can the components continue to be edited? I imagine that would make a lot of sense, but how often does that happen, and how does that look in a company?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it will definitely be dynamic. It will be updated fairly often. And what typically happens is when it first is engaged with the new system. Typically, in this example, the telehealth system, that is going to be the first phase. Will be with the architecture team, and they'll build it out. They'll build that threat model, and then they'll most likely pass that over to the red team. And so a separate part of the organization will go through it. And typically the architecture team will spend a few weeks on it. They'll do a lot of research. Again, anyone in the security field will tell you that Google is their friend. They will look at open source threat intelligence reports where they could read up on how certain systems might be getting exploited by threats in the wild, and they will go through that. They will review it. So it does take quite some time, because the security team needs to really understand that system, the assets part of that system, and then as the architecture team passes it over to the blue team, they will spend some significant amount of time. And again, they're going to come from a different perspective, because their mindset is, I want to make sure I can detect any intrusions before they happen. And again, they'll pass it over to the red team, and the red team is going to have a different perspective. And they may say, how can I use this threat model to be able to then break into a system? Because their job is to try to basically find gaps in the system themselves, security gaps and holes, because that's what they're doing. They're breaking into it.
Well, thank you for that. Is it a viable comparison to say, if you're building a house, since we're protecting the house, and you've got your architects, they're working on it, you've got your developers, your contractors, they've all looked at it, but then, and so you have your blueprint, but in the process of building it, if there are things that are uncovered, can you change it? Can you edit it? Well, of course, right? Of course you can if you want to, but then at some point you can't. Maybe that's where the metaphor, the allegory ends, is that with a threat system, you can always change it further, right? If new threats become evidenced.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Sorry, I think I broke up can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. And I'm still sharing, right? Because I think I lost internet for a second.
Oh, no, we got you back.
All right, perfect. So what I did hear, Reza, was you mentioned it's typically or considered aligned or very similar to someone building a house, where you have the architects, the contractors, the engineers, things, the developers, and then I lost you after that. What did you say?
Yes, my comparison or analogy, in case, Adrian, that's useful too for you as you think about how threat model could be explained to students. At what point can it still be negotiable? Because when you're building a house, and I think we might have lost Chris again.
Oh no, I think I'm here. I could definitely hear you.
Oh, good. At At what point does a threat model become static, or is it that it never does? And kind of like a house too, you could finish building it, but then hey, if I find that I need another wall, I can build another wall later on in the kitchen, right? Or I can knock a closet out. Is that a fair comparison to think about the static nature versus the elasticity of a threat model?
Yeah, that's a very good comparison, and that's usually the one that I would use. And I would say that it is very much similar to how you build a house, and almost the same way that when you make decisions, if you're living in Florida, you probably want hurricane, strength windows, and you'll make that decision down there. You may not make that same decision up in the New York region. It may not be the need for it because it is different, and it can also continually be updated, just the way that your plans will be updated because you've found an issue with the system, or you found an issue with how you were building the house, or you wanted to add a wall or remove a wall. Just the way that if you remove a wall on a load bearing part of the house, you got to reinforce it with another kind of bulkhead. Same thing. It's kind of you as you build your house and you update your house, it's very similar to the threat models with that. You do update those, and over time, what happens is, as a red team goes through their threat model and the red team actually performs their campaigns, and they do try to test how they can break into the systems, it will go that the security teams will go back to the threat models, and they will go back to their countermeasures, and they will update those and say, as part of the threat models, these are the threat vectors we used for elevating privileges, for spoofing, for what have you. And they will say, these are the countermeasures that need to be put in place. And they'll go back to the architects. They'll go back to the blue team, and they'll tell them, you need to go update controls. And so it's actually very much cyclical and very much elastic, where it will change, and that's that constant improvement that's actually required within a security organization.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
All right, so Adrian, that basically concludes really what a threat model could be used for. Do you have any questions on that? Would you anything else that you would like me to explain?
No question. I I I am kind of curious though. Within a security team, how is CrowdStrike used?
So CrowdStrike, um, it could be used in multiple ways, but I will ask you this: what have you heard about CrowdStrike? What do you know about it?
Well, quite a few of my students that have graduated, they've got their Falcon certifications. They're in security. They're doing big things. The Department of Education uses CrowdStrike, and they're a pain in my ass.
And in terms of a pain, meaning what they're blocking, what they're
So we do a lot. I do a lot of cybersecurity labs, um, Trojans, DDoSing simulations, and I get a call about 4 or 5 times a week. What are you doing? What are you doing? And then people just show up to my class, re-image my computers.
so they obviously it's yeah, I mean, so depending on how it's deployed, if they're using it for might be endpoint solution, so they
Yeah,
may
it's an
actually
endpoint.
on the endpoint if it's an agent. Sometimes it also, I've seen it be used inline in the network too. So CrowdStrike has a few different offerings, and then those offerings definitely could be like what you would consider blocking at the network layer, and then in this case even the endpoint. So they'll pick up traffic that's flowing through the network and identify that there are in your case, definitely they've picked up some type of Trojan virus, or another worm, or any type of other virus that we may see. They definitely have picked that up, and they must be coming to your desk, or to your office, or to your classroom, I should
So
say.
I think my question is, what the security architect be the one to implement this type of technology? Would they make the final call on it?
It's actually
Kind of broke up there, Chris. Yeah, I think we lost them.
Hey, can you guys hear me now? It looks
Yeah, we
like
can
I
hear you
heard
now.
for a
You're
second.
back.
All right, great. So I heard your question, and here's how I would describe that. So if it's the architect that you're talking about, the architect would define what controls they want to have in place and why. So they may provide, say, all right, if our decision is to go down to the tooling, they would actually even, depending on an organization, they would select that tool. The engineering team would actually go how to build it out. They would be the how. So the engineering team would be the one to implement CrowdStrike and implement it at whatever layer they're looking at, where the architect comes in and says, layers of defense in depth. Where do we get into having CrowdStrike with, say, Carbon Black that's out there, which is another endpoint security solution, or a next generation firewall, which integrates your typical firewall with maybe modules for intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, and then something like CrowdStrike that's also behavioral based that will pick up behaviors that look very similar to malicious activity. The architect will put that together, and that really what they do as part of their blueprints, just the way that we put locks on our doors and locks on our windows. So that would be chosen by the architect.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right. So what I wanted to go into is the next is threat intelligence, and just drill into what that really is. And so what I wanted to start with these, though, maybe not as much in the hands-on realm that you'd think, but
You're back.
I think you guys can hear me now. It looks like I was lost for a second. Can you hear me again?
Yep, you're good.
All right. Sorry about that. I'm getting some internet service in and out. I'm trying to see if someone is hogging my internet, so I'm just texting them real quick to get off. All right. So what I wanted to go into now is threat intel. What I was saying before I lost the internet service again was the fact that we're starting here because advanced topics don't necessarily mean advancement in just having more programming skills. Cybersecurity requires breadth and depth in a lot of different areas of cybersecurity. And threat model culminates in that, in where you really need to be aware of and have advanced knowledge in many different areas of cybersecurity. Networking, you need to have experience in endpoint, you need to have experience in access controls, and so on and so forth. So that's why we started there. So this year, we could go into what it looks like, what threat intel is. So I will share with you a actual threat intel report on what those look like, because I think that's definitely going to be a good point. So here, when you're developing a threat intel report, again, it's very similar to some of the stuff we're going to hear we heard from the threat model, but from a different perspective. So in this case, we're going to talk through what threat vectors might be exploiting systems. And this one here, again, starting with Chalupa botnet, brute force on IoT devices. So again, pretty important. Again, pretty damaging too to IoT devices. Easy way to describe what this actually means is that there is a botnet that can go through IoT devices and then use it for targeting DDoS. So easiest way to describe this was a couple years ago, there was an outage on our internet servers. So this is literally the servers that support our internet. They went down for a few hours because the internet servers were being DDoS by a bunch of IoT devices. So let me explain what that means. What that means was, and what they're describing here, is that the botnet was able to infiltrate IoT devices. So that could be something like a Ring device that we see on the doorbell. It could be other things such as our televisions. It could be, like light bulbs. Now we see a lot of that, and the botnet pointed all of those devices to the internet servers and rendered them to be, well, in this case, denial of service. So if we go back to the threat model, the big thing there is D, which is denial of service, and that's what this is going to. But where this goes into further is this actually breaks in what the threat, basically intel or threat information is going to give us. So it's going to give us threat vector, it's going to give us threat actor, it's going to start giving us what the assets are, but also tells us how were the devices compromised. And here they talk about SSH credentials were taken. And when they were doing that, they were running commands. And then it talks about where they were actually found and what are the IP addresses. So now you have the IP addresses of the threat actor. You have what they were looking to exploit, how they got in. So they look at SSH. So SSH is fairly common across devices, especially devices on the Linux side. So that's definitely, again, something that you see here in the threat intel report, because this information, differently than the threat model, this information is actual exploits in the wild, and now taking this information and wanting it to go and maybe shore up or secure different systems. So I'll ask you that question to you is, what teams do you think would actually apply threat intel?
Red team?
So red team could definitely use it, yes. Now red team would use it in the sense of they're going to want to take it to test out if any of their organization's systems are vulnerable and could actually be impacted by this particular type of attack with the SSH credentials trying to break into an IoT device. Where else do you think in the organization?
Well, it has to be both red and blue.
Yes, exactly. So it would definitely be blue team. Why do you think the blue team?
Because they're in charge of protecting the whole shebang.
They are. What would they use it for?
To see if their devices, their IoT devices, are susceptible to this botnet.
And if it was, what would they do with that information?
Take it to the red team and have them test it out.
So that would be one example. Yes, they could test it out. But what also the blue team would do with it is, how do I build out more countermeasures, and how do I build out more detections and alerting capabilities so that I could identify someone or a set of threat actors trying to utilize this type of threat vector and this exploit against my systems. So that's where the blue team would come in. They would look to build detections. They would look to build countermeasures because they're trying to improve security, and they're ultimately responsible for basically, as you said, the whole shebang. So that's where they come in and really try to tighten it up.
All right, Chris, just a quick question. I
Sure.
don't know if I missed it on the report, but were these IoT devices behind a firewall?
So these were not, and that's actually that's a great example that the blue team would look back and say, okay, is this behind a firewall? No, it's not. So now we don't have visibility. We don't have basically the right type of protections. So these are exposed. These devices are exposed directly to the internet, which means,
so they have like a SIM card or whatnot.
yeah, they're
Okay.
exactly. They have SIM card. They may just have direct, they may even have an IP address, which means that if I go and look and find them,
Ah,
I could go directly out and just go on a quick search, say on what some of the things Maurice is getting into, which is Shodan. Do a quick search for IoT devices, and I could find all the ones that are exposed to the internet that I could get into that aren't
gotcha.
behind firewalls. So yeah, that's what you could do with threat intel reports, and that's how they're basically, this is how they're essentially how they're written. Um, so we could, I know we only have about 40 minutes left, a little bit less than that, 35. So would definitely like to move on, but if you have any questions, kind of.
I have a small question. Again, just a curiosity, who writes these reports?
That's a good question.
And Adrian, while we get Chris back, I ask just because, hey, like when we think about career exposure for students, right? It's not all just quant people. It's not all just coders. Like someone's got to write this and make sure that the grammar checks out, right? And to be able to interpret this stuff for the tech people, but also for people who are not super technical to be able to read it. So, Chris, is that a job for someone to write these reports?
It absolutely is, and the example I would give you is right to what you're saying. There have been that I've seen a few, at least one example of an opera singer who has a background actually in English, and they are able to use that. And they said, okay, they were going to be they were, as part of their undergraduate degree in English, they were able to take that writing skills and be able to translate to now building out threat intel reports, developing, writing them.
It's really
Can you hear me?
yes.
All right, perfect. Yeah. So they were able to do that using their English degree, and they were able to understand and learn that technology pack. So yes, it absolutely is a job, and it's one that you may hear with threat intel. A lot of the government agencies definitely hire that level of especially digging into threat vectors and stuff like that. But not always do you need to have quants or that type of background. You hear plenty of folks with English majors or maybe not English majors, but just anyone that may not have that programming background. It's very easy to learn this stuff.
And it sounds like you would need to have an understanding of a much broader swath of cybersecurity to write that, versus if you work on the blue team, right? You have to have much more specialized skills. The old generalist versus specialist question.
Absolutely, and that's a really good way of putting it, because within cybersecurity, you could learn the surface of really every area and every domain, and that may lead you to be more of on the risk side, or in this case, threat intel or management side, where you need to have a breadth and depth of a lot, but it may not qualify you for, say, very uh engineering type role in the blue team or even the red team, where you do need more hands-on skills and you need to be specialized in some of those areas. So that's definitely the cool thing about cybersecurity. So I know we have some time left. So what I was thinking was I'll share my screen again and we could get into some of the next thing I really wanted to drill into was vulnerability scans. So I'll jump through to that and get that on the list. Let's start going into that next. So the reason why I wanted to jump into this next is we have threat intel. We talked about threat modeling before that, and now it's going to be really good to actually get into a sample vulnerability scan. So let me share my screen again. And so with this,
I need some paper.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, my wife just needs some.
It's okay. It's totally after hours. Our
Yeah.
teachers are
Yeah,
like
you're fine.
4 hours after hours, so we're all in it together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right, so we talked about threat modeling, threat intel. What's the next logical step is to actually start going through how do you identify vulnerabilities. So you may hear about vulnerability scans. The one I have up here is OpenVAS. And there are some lessons that I could even drill into that go through how to actually set up scans and go through the like there, which we could get into if we want to. But I think the best thing I really wanted to do was actually get through interpreting the vulnerability report. And so when you tap it, let me ask you this, Adrian, what experience do you have or not experience, just knowledge you have of when someone says the word vulnerability? What does that mean to you?
I could be an exploit. It could, usually an exploit or weak passwords.
So that's definitely an example. Yeah, the weak passwords could be a vulnerability in the sense that someone could steal those credentials, those passwords fairly easy. Have you heard about vulnerabilities on a Windows server, on a
Yes.
Windows laptop, and things like? What does that mean to you there?
It means that a hot fix needs to be applied, that there could be a 0 day waiting to happen.
So you bring up another term, which is interesting. I'm going to ask you what does 0 day mean to you?
It's an exploit that's, been undetected for quite a while, and at a given point in time, that exploit will simultaneously go off on whatever computers it's on.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I do like what you described it. I think that's definitely part of it. The other piece to it is could be that it has been undetected for some time. It also could mean that it's most could recently be detected, but most likely it's detected in a sense that you hear of a lot of those actually after like Black Hat conferences that come out, and what that means is someone may find a vulnerability in a system, and there may not be an actual way to fix that vulnerability. So that's definitely what you're hearing in a 0 day. So now, when a vulnerability on a system like a Windows system, typically may happen or may occur. Windows comes out every month with new ones on Patch Tuesday, and so you may have systems that actually are vulnerable. You in an organization, what you find is that they're not always up to date. The organization may not always be up to date on their patching, and they may have vulnerabilities on their system. And what it's important to know is that as although it's fairly straightforward to run a vulnerability scan, you put an IP address into the system and into the scanner, and then run a scan, and it will basically pull a report. That is definitely skill, and that's part of what engineers do, and it's a great thing, and we could even get to it next. But what's really important is actually interpreting the results of a vulnerability scan. So that's what I really wanted to drill into. And so this is just a sample report. OpenVAS is something you could actually use as part of Metasploit. So it's definitely part of within actually really Kali Linux, and you could pull that down and use it. It's free. There are other products out there such as Nessus and Qualys, which are two tools of choice for vulnerability management. And they are used to run scans against network devices, as well as they're used to scan against desktops and servers and the like. So I'll pause there. Does that kind of make sense? What VM is, vulnerability management is, what a vulnerability is, and kind of the basics of that?
This VAS, is it a report?
Yes, what you're looking at is a report, but OpenVAS is actually a tool that will run scans, and it will run scans against actually against a device, a Windows device, and it will check for uh, vulnerabilities and exposures, common vulnerabilities and exposures. Those are CVEs. We can drill into what that looks like. Let me.
So how is it different from Metasploit?
So Metasploit goes a step further and also picks up what particular ways to exploit that vulnerability.
Ah,
So
gotcha.
it goes definitely further into that. The Metasploit framework basically gives you a series of packages that you could use to exploit vulnerabilities, but it OpenVAS is more used to provide you with some of that knowledge of what particular vulnerabilities are. So I'll ask you this: who would use a vulnerability scanner like an OpenVAS or a Qualys versus who in the organization would use Metasploit?
A penetration tester would use uh, Open VAS, and Blue Team would use Metasploit.
Why do you think that?
Because if Metasploit gives you what exploits are available and the tools to use them, then the Blue Team would be able to mitigate that. No?
So that is it's definitely a good perspective, and yes, part of the blue team definitely does that, and they would look at that and they would take a tool like Metasploit and find vulnerabilities and find ways of how it could be exploited, and then they would build detections into there. Then there's another part of the blue team where their focus is looking at just OpenVAS, looking at Qualys, and they look at the vulnerabilities and they ultimately are working with teams to fix those vulnerabilities. So if it's a critical vulnerability, they'll look to get it patched, and that's another part of the blue team as well. So two sides of that coin, and the reason why there are two sides to it is not all the time can you actually remediate vulnerabilities in a timely manner. It might be right by the holidays, and the organization may have a change freeze, and they don't want their systems going down during the holiday season, and therefore you may have a blue team that comes in and says, all right, well, let's go try to exploit what this looks like in a lab. Let's use Metasploit, and let's find out the steps it took for us to exploit this, and then let's go build out detections so that we can alert on this if we see this traffic. So I'll pause there. Does that make sense?
Yep, complete.
All right, great. So we kind of dove into vulnerabilities already. This is stuff that we talked about. I mentioned this: common vulnerabilities and exposures. This is a lot of information that actually is available. We definitely could do a quick search for CVEs and find it across any system you want. We did talk about vulnerability 0 days as well. What I wanted to talk about was where does OpenVAS sit? So it's a vulnerability scanning tool, and they're going to scan for vulnerabilities. It's going to look for unpatched and insecure systems. There's also port scanning, which can also be done by an OpenVAS and can also be done by a Qualys. So that's going to look at what ports are open. So if I'm looking at this from two sides of the equation, one side of the equation is I'm going to do a scan of my network to find out if I have any insecure ports open because I want to fix them. And I'm also going to scan for vulnerabilities on systems so that I can fix them. There's that part of it. And there's a very large contingent of of an organization that will handle that as part of a blue team. And they will have a team that runs scans. They are constantly running scans. They'll run it once a week. They'll have them automated. They'll have them scheduled, and they're meant to scan the entire network for open ports and vulnerability scans, or vulnerabilities, I should say. And that's what they're meant to do. There's another part of that same team that works with the system owners to remediate those vulnerabilities. So there's a whole nother set of remediation activity required. And that usually is folks outside of an IT security organization, the cybersecurity org. And that team ends up, the team that's outside that does the actual remediation activity, that is something where members of the blue team would go and work with them and explain to them what the vulnerability is, why it's impactful, why it is high risk, and work with those teams outside the org of the IT space, IT security space, to go and fix them. So I'll pause there. Does that half of the equation make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And then, of course, you have the other half of it, which is more in the ethical hacking side, or in this case, the red team. They're going to want to know, they're going to want to run a port scan. They're going to want to run a port vulnerability scan, because that's going to open the door for them to know which door is open and which one can they walk into. So that's pretty critical. And then obviously network mapping, which is more Nmap, which is getting into actually how the network is structured. And so here's what we're laying out to for this particular example. This is more for the ethical hacker, but they'll review the scan results, they'll map out a plan of attack, um, and then we'll get into what an example of that looks like. So here's the sample report. And so what it has here, this is open VAS. It has some contents here, table of contents, host summary, vulnerability, just one host. In this case, it was just one host, but it's going to look at port summary and it's going to look at security issues. So here's the host. It found one high, 6 medium, and 1 low. So Windows SMB is one of the high vulnerabilities here. So I'm going to ask you, do you know what SMB is? Do you know what that protocol is used for?
To authenticate Windows access to directories.
So yeah, it definitely could be there, and then basically in a even higher level is just communication between different servers. Um, and that's definitely throughout. So there's different versions of it, and there's SMB signing, which will give you a stronger layer of authentication, and then there's ones where there's no signing required, and they can just a server communicate with another server. So now, if I am an ethical hacker, if I'm a red team, and I see this vulnerability, what do you think it means to me?
You can brute force it.
Sure, you could brute force it, but I think that if I have this type of vulnerability and I can communicate with, if I get access to this and I'm able to communicate with many servers in the domain, and there's
Yeah.
this version, this version of SMB in there, and I could basically, in this case, literally use remote access in and get into all of my servers. What do you think? What do you think I could do with that?
Anything you wanted if you get system admin credentials.
Right, if you get admin credentials, and then what do you think I could actually plant on a server that then will spread to many other servers?
A worm, a
Could do
virus,
a
a
worm.
Trojan,
Trojan is another example.
a
I'm
bot,
gonna I'm gonna go a little further. What have you seen recently that's happened a lot with hospitals now?
ransomware.
Absolutely. So ransomware is, and this is why this is a great example of all it takes. I mean, this scan only shows what, 8 vulnerabilities? And one of them could own the
Only.
entire house. So that's the fascinating thing about this. And the exercise, we're going through it now, just I'm logically speaking to you, but with the students, would have the students actually research this. What is SMB? What is it used for? What type of attacks are used against SMB? Things like that. And that's the exercise we go into with vulnerability scanning, because it's actually not like there's definitely skill involved in setting up vulnerability scans, and it's a very big job to input the right IP addresses, being able to scan the right profiles against a device. But it's also a very strong skill to interpret the results. So in this exercise, I really wanted to make sure students could interpret the results and know where to go to interpret it, because as anyone knows, there's so many facets of cybersecurity that you're not going to know everything. And the point is to let some of the students get to know that and get them to know that early if they really want to put it, if they really want to pursue a career in here in the field, because Google can be, is your friend, and you could learn a lot from just searching around what this vulnerability is and digging around on how severe it is and how to interpret the results when you find a vulnerability like this. So, there's a few other ones here. Insecure SSL, which again is around using insecure, maybe TLS 1.0. So that's encryption and communication, encryption in transit. If you're using weaker cipher keys, that would mean that they can be exploited or they can be stolen, and you can basically grab the traffic, the information in the packet. So that's something that's a little bit of a lower risk. The reason, well, let me ask you this: why do you think SSL and TLS are lower risk than SMB?
Because they're encrypted.
So it's actually, the risk here is that the encryption algorithm is a weak cipher. So it's a weaker encryption. So it's almost like using not using advanced encryption, but having, say, like lower levels of algorithms to encrypt anything around HTTPS here. So web traffic on port 443.
Right.
So what it's saying here is, in this case, there is a weaker cipher. What they're saying is, yes, it can be broken. So the actual algorithm behind the encryption can be broken, but that does take more effort to get there to actually break it. And yes, it still is encrypted, as to your point. So they're actually rating it as a lower score. And the CVSS is the CVE. It gives you a vulnerability scoring, and this is why they're going to rate it as an SMB as 9.3, which is 9.3 out of 10. And then these other ones around encryption, TLS, weak cipher suite are actually 5 and 4.3. So I'll pause there. Just how does that relate to what we saw with threat model and threat intel, and now kind of drilling into the into the vulnerability scans?
It gives great insight as to what needs to be fixed.
Nice. Okay. All right. Great. So it definitely is giving you. So what I wanted to do now is, let's see if we could get into a few. Let's see. This one's more vulnerability scanning. We'll kind of walk you through this more the analysis again. This is another one. Let's see what. All right. So this open VAS report that we saw. Still good, but I don't think we want to go into that. There's another one there. Let's see. So here's an exercise that we could drill into and kind of explain to you what this actually is. So the point here in some of these exercises is getting into Metasploit and how we could actually exploit what's on the vulnerable server. Um, so in this case here, we walked through, setting up the virtual box, which we don't have now, but we could still go through some of the results here um, and what it actually is. So this is actually a walkthrough of it. Do you understand what? Have you used Metasploit before?
Sorry, you broke up. What was that?
Oh, sorry about that. Have you worked through Metasploit before? Have you used it before?
I've used it briefly. Haven't had a real opportunity to play around with it a lot, but I have used Kali up to, and Backtrack back in the days.
All right. So what did you use Kali for?
Um, WEP decryption, WPA decryption. When I couldn't, like get Wi-Fi.
Nice. Okay. All right. Great. So, what I was thinking was trying to see if we want to go into damn vulnerable web app or if we want to go into Metasploitable. I think with the time we have left, I don't want to start something where we can't finish. So, um, why don't we skip actually to some of the more another one that's more manageable, which is again a management skill set, which is important for us to know, which is going to be through scenarios. So let me just share my my screen from some for the next one. So I figured, switching gears, instead of going into Metasploitable, which will take a little bit of time, and even the damn vulnerable web app, which shows us some exploits, I wanted to actually go through an IR tabletop exercise and kind of share with you what that looks like. So what we went through today, what we've covered in the first hour, we talked about threat modeling. We talked about how teams in security use threat modeling, and we also talked about how teams use threat intelligence. And then we went into the other side of it, which is how to interpret vulnerability management. So we talked about how red team would be engaged with those reports, how blue team would be engaged with those reports, and just kind of the ecosystem of how they fit. So there's another thing that's pretty important to drill into, which is an incident response tabletop. Let me see if I can pull that up. So what an incident response tabletop exercise is, and again, brings a culmination of what the organization has been working on, what they've done through their threat model exercises, what they've done to produce their threat intel, their very strong knowledge of threat vectors, threat actors that might be trying to exploit their network, and vulnerabilities within the system. And so it's a culmination of that in actually scenarios where organization will be given a scenario and then walk through how does it apply to their environment. So we'll go through instructions. I mean, you play any one of the roles. We'll just go through it fairly quickly. We only have a few minutes left, but we'll get the intent of and the outcome of it. So here's an example. A hacktivist group threatens to target your organization following an incident involving allegation of use of excessive force by law enforcement. You do not know how the nature, you do not know the nature of the attack they're planning. How can you improve your posture to best protect your organization? So from the information we started to work through with threat models, with threat intel, and then ultimately drawn into vulnerability scanning, what how would you tackle this type of scenario?
Um, Start up Open VAS, look for areas of weakness, and make the necessary changes where weaknesses lie.
Okay. I like that answer. That's definitely one part. And who would take part in that? Who would do that exercise?
The blue team.
Yes, very, very good. Definitely the blue team. Now, another thing I would want to consider is what would you think about this when you see when it talks about a hacktivist group? What does that mean to you?
Um, Hacktivist group. I would. Hmm. It's very like anonymous. Could be a
Right.
hacktivist group.
Absolutely. That's very good. So now when I'm given this scenario, I would go back to my threat intel team and say, okay, what does a hacktivist group do? What are their like tactics? What are their techniques? What do they usually do? So now, in my experience with a hacktivist group, they're very big into trying to disrupt and destroy websites, deface websites, things like that. they're not into like financial crimes groups, which are into, they want your credit card information, they want your social security information, things like that. Hacktivist groups don't really care about that. So now they're trying to target the organization. And now thinking about from our threat intel reports when we were doing threat, for understanding the threat actor and where they were coming from, uh, that's where you go back to their team and say, okay, what do we know about them? And we could look at, all right, where are they going to deface? They're probably going to deface a website. So let's run a vulnerability scan against their website. Let's drill into that with, using OpenVAS, let our blue team get involved in that. And let our threat intel team also review what techniques does a hacktivist group. Now, what do you think will be the next step after they now have identified what the hacktivist group may do? Where do you think they would go next? Where do you think the threat intel team would go next?
I think the next logical thing to do would, create a plan to mitigate any attacks that are coming their way.
And how would they get into some of the mitigation strategy? What do you think that would be? One part we already talked about, which is on the vulnerability scans and making sure we're remediating that. But what else can they do? What else? What other mitigation strategies can they take part in?
Hmm. Good question. Network hardening.
Yeah, network hardening definitely works. We talked about remediating vulnerabilities on the web application. You definitely, I would say, network hardening is a good answer. Also, maybe tightening up the web application firewalls. And so, if part of the threat intel report, we talked about, we want to know about the threat actors. We're also going to want to know, where do they originate from? So we may have, if our threat intel report and our threat intel team is good, we might be able to get IP addresses. So we could start blocking them and blocking those IP addresses at the web application firewall layer. We could probably even do it, depending on where it sits. We might be able to do it within our firewalls and the like. That's where you basically now take what's in a threat intel report, and in this situation, take it, and sometimes it may be that you first build a threat intel report against a hacktivist group, and then you go and find out what are the ways I could go mitigate those risks. So I'll pause there. Uh, what do you think? What is that? How does that look to you when you see a scenario like this, and how does it relate to what we talked about with the threat side of the house and the vulnerability side?
This is all excellent. I'm loving it, but thinking how I'm gonna teach this, it's making me worry because these are like critical thinking. It's a skill that can't be taught to these kids, and I- I'm I'm overwhelmed just thinking how to get this activity across to my kids.
Adrian, join the teachers working group that will continue to think about that. And Chris, give your advice too. I'm just plugging in my aims for the group.
Yeah, no, I totally it, and I thank you for the candid feedback, because it definitely can be overwhelming. But where the good thing is about this, where we haven't really shown you, is this is actually this is the last lesson, say like the last two lessons.
Okay, then that makes sense.
And so what you as a teacher have, and so there's questions here that get the students, for you as a teacher to get the students to start thinking about. But this is a culmination of what they've done with Metasploitable, what they've done with the vulnerable web app, some of the earlier lessons on cryptography. And reason why I chose this one was, well, we've done some analysis of damn vulnerable web app, which is basically what a vulnerable web application looks like and how you can exploit that. So knowing that what a hacked, and we even go into, there's lessons on this about threat actors and what a hacktivist group is. So a lot of that is, you could kind of bring those lessons back to the forefront with the students. And there's some thought-provoking questions to try to get the students back into that. But the intent is that the students aren't relying on, say, previous knowledge from a previous class, but more so of at least what they've learned in the last year. And even then, it's hard. So that's where you could reference previous lessons and kind of have them on the side as well. If you remember what we did with the threat actors or the threat intel or even the threat modeling, or what we did with Metasploitable, those could kind of get the ideas back into the students' minds. And that's where this ends. That's the culmination of where this class ends. And there's even a lesson on building a final report of lessons learned from these tabletop exercises. So that's where it tries to reinforce everything they've learned over the last, whether it's half a year or a full year worth of the course.
Gotcha.
Folks, I think we've been invited back to our main room. I think our featured guest and mystery guest is coming in soon. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.